The thing is that if you are a podcaster or you are interested in this industry overall, you got to really understand that podcast directories can really make or break your podcast in the first place. So you have to really integrate, if you will, podcast directory listing in as part of your strategy, not only in the short run but also in the long run. So let me give you some general considerations here. So when you think about the best podcast the directories this year, you have to really understand that it's not just about where you are listening your podcast. It's where your target audience is hanging out at. Okay, and there has to be a sync between where your audience is located and where they hang out versus where you actually list your content. It is really important. Should you go on Spotify? Should you go on Apple Podcasts? Should you go on Google Podcasts? Should you go on Amazon? Should you go on iHeartRadio? You got to really understand what really works for you. So the world of podcast distribution is all about how to get your podcast from your host and out to the world. And one of the simplest way is to actually take advantage of the many podcast directories and listening platforms on the market right now. And a lot of them are kind of free. So that's kind of cool. The thing is that when you think about a podcast directory, I want you to think about a platform that's built for podcast listening. Okay, it's one of those things where you have to really make sure, again, that you want to make things a lot easier for your listeners. Okay, now there is no shortage of contenders when it comes to the best podcast directories this year. But the thing is that let me first ask you a question. Where are your competitors actually listing their podcast? What directories are they choosing? Because the whole thing is you are not trying to reinvent the wheel. Because if your competitors are overwhelmingly listing their podcast on, say, Apple, why should you go to Spotify? Because your target audience is likely already on Apple, so Apple Podcasts that way. So it's just a lot better to actually do the same thing to emulate what your competitors are doing. Okay, podcast listeners consume podcasts in a huge range of ways. Not all of them as you would think. So it's important to really understand that your listeners are not just 100% on the best podcast directories, but at least you can actually have 75 to 80% of them on those directories, because once again, those directories are created specifically for podcast listening. The thing is, if you're thinking about the best podcast directories this year, it means that you are interested in terms of brand recognition. You're interested in monetization. You're interested in having several avenues for revenue. But it's important to understand that podcast directories are actually part of a conduit called podcast distribution, because it's all about, like, once you create your wonderful piece of content, you have to think about how to distribute it. And a directory is just one area where you can actually list it. You can also have your podcast available on YouTube, for instance. You can have it on your website, or you can even have it behind a paywall locked sort of a private podcast sort of platform. So you have a lot of possibilities here. Okay, and so the thing is that basically, in terms of podcast distribution, you upload your audio file to a podcast hosting platform. Okay, so that's basically where the podcast is stored on the web. I've already told you on another show that you do not want to host your podcast on your own website for many reasons. It's just a lot better to actually not, and also it's also better to diversify, not put all your eggs in the same proverbial basket. Okay, so you want to go to a host, you want to go to a podcast hosting platform that's actually built exclusively for that kind of work. And so once you upload your audio file to a podcast hosting platform, you, with the help of your hosting platform, register your podcast with the top directories. What happens here is that some hosting platforms will do it for you automatically. So they actually have they are fully integrated with all the top directories, and they will actually share your files. They'll share your podcast also, and this happens automatically. There's nothing done manually here. So they will share your podcast, let's say, automatically they'll share it with the top directories, and the directories actually will handle distribution while your host handles delivery. Very important to remember that the directories will actually handle distribution while your host handles delivery. So in short, when people talk about distribution, they're usually talking about a combination of podcast search and podcast delivery. And so the directories allow people to find your podcast, and the hosting delivers the audio. to their device. So that's kind of important to think about. So let me talk to you now about the directories. So the best podcast directory lists, of course, you have on top of the chain, the food chain, you have Apple Podcasts or iTunes. Okay, it's not going away. Apple Podcasts, formerly iTunes, is and always has been the top platform for podcasting. Other podcast directories are making inroads, such as the one that I will cover into this conversation, but Apple Podcasts, iTunes should still be on your first stop. Okay, and on nearly all of our podcasts, for example, over 60 to 70% of the top podcasts we have actually seen, especially the downloads, actually came through either iTunes or the Apple Podcast app. Okay, so this is important. It is very significant. So besides Apple Podcast, iTunes, I want you to think about the Spotify. And Spotify was already giants in the music streaming space. So it's actually no surprise that they actually, like the company, started into that. They started in doing a lot into podcasting. Okay, in fact, when you think about Spotify now, if Apple Podcasts is about 60% of the market, Spotify is taking 30%, 30 to 35%. So this is pretty huge. Okay, so should you actually list on Spotify? Of course, it makes a lot of sense. You do not want to really ignore such a behemoth when it comes to a podcast directory. Okay, there is already a ton of people using the app for their music, or who've been using it for years. This is actually integrated into people's lives, and now having the option to listen to podcasts on there means they don't need any other app. So it's a no-brainer. Add to that some really heavy promotion by Spotify. Podcasts are listed just a few rows down on the homepage. Then we are on to a winner. So that's kind of cool. It's also a great option for Android users who can access the Apple Podcast app on their phones, and you want to make sure it's easy for all of your listeners to hear your show, right? Not just the ones actually using Apple devices. You want all your listeners to actually get a chance to enjoy your beautiful content. If you're thinking about the best podcast directories this year, I want you to think about Google Podcast. And Google has been, let's say, they actually haven't really decided to invest heavily when it comes to podcasting. Okay, so Google has had a bit of on and off relationship with podcast distribution over the years, but there has been high hopes of that changing recently with the launch of Google Podcast. This shouldn't actually be confused with Google Play Music, incidentally. The app has faced a lot of criticism since its launch. It has been accused of being far too basic, and also the fact that it doesn't appear visibly on users' phone by default, like Apple Podcasts, has frustrated many podcasters too. So it's one of those things where you have to think about it. But having said that, having a company the size of Google pay attention to podcasts can only be a good thing, and fingers crossed that they will be monitoring, reviewing, and upgrading the app as time goes by. You also have Amazon Audible. So basically, if you're looking for the best podcast directories this year, Amazon/Audible is actually a great app to think about. Amazon has its fingers on every pie, and podcasts are no exception. So the company, along with its audiobook wing Audible, is actually it's an increasingly popular place to find and listen to podcasts. And so that's kind of cool because it gives you possibilities, it gives you a flexibility. And so this is really good. And one thing I want to say here is that it's important to understand that with Amazon, you have skill. This is really important, especially when you are a beginner or even an experienced podcaster for that matter. And also when you think about Amazon/Audible, think about the geography of your audience. If your audience is, let's say, in English speaking countries, you have more chances of actually scaling real fast. But if your audience is kind of scattered around, some of them are in English speaking countries, others are in non-English speaking countries, then you are really it's a more complex. Let's say, for instance, you have you have audience in Germany, you have audience in Nigeria, you have audience in Australia, you have audience in Brazil, you have audience in Jakarta, in Indonesia. So that's really not really from a linguistic point of view, it's not really consistent. So this could be a little more problematic for you. But it's not impossible though, but more a little difficult. If you are thinking about the best podcast directories this year, I want you to think about TuneIn Radio. And TuneIn Radio is kind of cool because you are able to have access to a range of other platforms. So like Sonos, okay. So this is kind of cool, and you are able to when you think about TuneIn Radio, think about an application-based service that allows people to find and stream your podcast on the go. So this is a great way, if you were to ask me, to reach new listeners at a time when they are looking to consume straight away. I mean, TuneIn Radio was really big during COVID. I mean, a lot of folks were home, and a lot of folks wanted to consume podcasts real fast. So this is kind of cool. And TuneIn still accounts for less than 0.2% of total podcast downloads, but it's definitely a useful portion to offer your listeners, and also a handy place to be discovered. And this is what I want to insist on. When you think about TuneIn Radio, or you think about iHeartRadio, or when you think about Amazon Audible, like those, like the top three, Apple, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, those are great. But the other 6 or 7 or 8, they're good to be discovered. So if discoverability is important to you, you want to still list your podcast there. Next, you want to think about iHeartRadio. So iHeartRadio is actually a podcast and streaming audio platform with around 150 to 200 million active monthly listeners. So if your podcast already exists in Apple iTunes, it's likely already showing in iHeartRadio too, okay? But there's no harm in making sure that you are listed in iHeartRadio. That way you are able to expand your reach, and you're able to do things yourself and have confirmation that you are present on that app. One thing I want to insist on is that you are able to have your podcast listed on 5, 10 directories. Don't limit yourself to only 1 or 2 directories. No, the whole thing is that because it is free. I mean, those directories are free to list. Okay, of course, if you want to maybe if you want to gain more visibility, you might have to pay for stuff. But just to be listed, to have your podcast listed, is actually free. So you want to take advantage of that sort of a free option, and at least increase the vibes, the visibility of your podcast. You also have the podcast index. So if you are actually looking for the best podcast directories this year, think about the podcast index. This is actually an open source podcast directory. This means that anyone can add to it, a lot like Wikipedia. And how big it is? Well, as of late June 2024, it had over 4 to 6 million podcasts, actively. And it's growing fast, by the way. But like many open source projects, it gets technical and geeky real fast, okay? So it's one of those things where you have to see what works for you. Also, you can think about Stitcher. I mean, Stitcher formerly occupied second place with a share of around 5% of total podcast downloads. And so this is something to really think about. Now, unfortunately, the platform faded in recent years and announced that it was actually to close in August 2023. So this is something to really think about. Stitcher, it's no longer here. So you have to really think about other platforms. You can also think about YouTube. I mean, YouTube actually is a great podcast directory. I mean, YouTube is not really a podcast directory, but it is like you can use it as such, because this video streaming giant is also a potential destination for your podcast. Some hosting providers, Transistor, Red Circle, Libsyn, allow you to publish episodes to YouTube. Once published, this creates a static image video on the platform and is actually separate from your normal podcast download stats on all other platforms. And you can tag these videos on your YouTube channel as a podcast. And podcast performance on YouTube is a mixed bag depending on who you actually speak to, okay? But there's certainly no harm in making your show available there. So this is an important element, especially if you are trying to scale fast, because YouTube has a scalability possibility that's really, 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 really high, especially if you are, let's say, if you are targeting a multi-geography audience. If your audience is in separate countries, multiple countries, you can try YouTube to actually reach people real fast. But it's one of those things where, again, your strategy should match your particular vision. So, when you think about the best podcast directories, I want to share with you a few extras. What are the other podcast distribution options? Well, there are a plethora of podcast directories out there, with new ones starting up all the time. The good news is that you don't have to spend loads of time submitting to everyone you find, though, as most of them pull their listings from the Apple iTunes store. So, not only is Apple iTunes the place where you get the vast majority of your listeners, but being listed there also gets you into popular mobile apps like Pocket Cast by default. And so the best podcast hosts also tend to have great destination tools available so you can easily publish to places like YouTube when you upload your new episodes. For example, Transistor has a publish to YouTube feature, and Buzzsprout allows you to create short video clips for publishing on social. So that's kind of cool. So, bottom line here is what? Making your show available in as many places as possible lets your listeners decide where they want to listen. Make the top five listed here, like that. I just, your priority, Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcast, Amazon Audible, and TuneIn Radio. Okay. But one thing I want to say is that you have to really, again, making sure that you are in sync with what your audience is expecting. Okay. And so this is an important element. Now, the next steps here are that you might want to start promoting your podcast. I mean, allowing listeners to find and subscribe to your show wherever they want is hugely important. But there are many other proactive and innovative ways to grow your audience too. So this is an important element. So you want to really make sure that you are constantly on the move, because you want to understand that you are proposing, you are adding value to your listeners' lives, and this is an important element. When we think about the best podcast directories, I think I've said this before, but I want to say it again. And at the end of this show, it's important to understand that you want to be on those directories where your audience hangs out the more at. So if your directory is hanging out mostly on Google Podcast, go with Google Podcast. If your audience actually hangs out on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, go to Apple Podcasts. Okay, I mean, yes, simply because Apple Podcasts is the number one doesn't mean you have to be there if your audience is not there. There has to be a sync. Once again, there has to be a sync between where your audience is hanging out at and where you are listening your podcast. Especially if you are just a beginning podcast. In other words, nobody knows you. You are still trying to establish relationship. You are trying to establish some kind of prominence, and that prominence will help you down the road anyway. So, in closing to this conversation, I share with you the best podcast directories. I give you the general considerations, the directories themselves, and then the extras. Thank you so much. God bless you. I'll see you next time. Until then, remember, stay marvelous.